Hello everybody! So, despite the fact I tend to talk about Arena, Daggerfall, Battlespire, Redguard, the older Elder Scrolls games a lot. The sad fact is that most people, when they think of the Elder Scrolls at this point in time, think of that grueling cart scene in Skyrim. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, it isn't that bad, I'm going to recommend going back and revisiting Skyrim today. Not as a new player, but as a veteran who has gone through this before. Having seen the game world, now we can see this cart scene not as a mystery, an unknown part of the world opening itself up, but rather a roadblock to the real fun, which is what that unskippable period of time is. But again, to a veteran, the hand-holding is insulting. And more importantly, a waste of their time. A veteran replaying a game wants to jump directly into the game and tell the tutorial or introduction sequence, no, I already know all this, let's get to the fun already. In the case of Skyrim, the introduction sequence is actually two-part. The first half of the introduction sequence is the world-building segment. It goes from the beginning, when you're in the cart with Ulfric Stormcloak and the horse thief, and it leads up until the point where you create your character. A veteran slams escape, spacebar, or if they're on a controller, the start button, A, B, X, Y, triangle, square, what have you, to try to get it over with, because it's unnecessary, and they want to get to the create the character already. Now, Fallout 4 learned from this. The introduction cutscene, War Never Changes, can be skipped with a button press, and you can go directly to the character creation. Now, everything up to being thought out in Vault 111 may feel like unnecessary padding and storyline building, but there's a huge difference between that time and the skippable time before that. You have fully created your character and you are able to move about. You have agency as a player, even if that agency doesn't amount to much. The introduction sequence of Fallout 4 either has you dying in a fiery explosion if you try to go off the path they've laid for you, or it gets you into the vault safely. So really, Fallout 4 actually learned from Skyrim and allowed you to skip the uncontrollable part. But from that point onward, it still commits the sin of pussyfooting around with the idea of creating your own character, because you're not really creating your own character. You're slapping a custom appearance on a Nate or Nora. These characters that Bethesda have predefined for you. They've become obsessed with a narrative and putting the characters in the shoes they want them in. To create a cinematic storytelling situation without actually committing to it is very similar to Mass Effect in the sense where you're still Shepard even if you get to customize their appearance. We've already talked about in previous videos how Skyrim pussyfoots around with the power fantasy concept without fully committing to it. I will have two videos linked below regarding that. One where I more or less insult the power fantasy concept, and the other one where I talk about how power fantasy is actually good if properly committed to, something Bethesda didn't do properly. But what we're talking about here is the introduction sequence of these games, and how they try to craft the story for you, try to shape how you think as a player. In Skyrim, they place you in Ulfric Stormcloak's proverbial camp by having the Imperials attempt to execute you. You may not have been that male Nord wearing iron armor shouting Fus Ro Da from the trailer, but that's the character they wanted you to become. That's the way they molded the early story in the early game experience to make that far, far more likely to occur, to make you that Dovahkiin. If all you knew about was Skyrim, and you knew nothing about the Empire from Arena, Daggerfall, Morrowind, or Oblivion, then the obvious choice, just having played Skyrim and nothing else, would be the Stormcloak Rebellion, because you wouldn't know any better. you wouldn't have developed feelings for that Imperial theme over time. Back when I used to write scenarios for a text-based game, a big part of what I was doing was to guide the player's choices so that they felt like the choice was one they wanted to make, that it was natural, that it was their idea to do those things. So why give the player a choice at all? Was it really their choice to begin with, if there really isn't huge differences between the Imperials or the Stormcloaks? Well, I'll discuss the bare-bones Civil War at another time and how it wouldn't have worked at all. But for the purposes of this video, the point is, the first half of the introduction sequence was to guide your choices in a world where ultimately your choice, as far as the main plot goes, has no meaning. The second half, on the other hand, starts just as the dragon is attacking. Or in the case of Fallout 4, when you're just being thawed out in the vault. During these sequences, both the dragon attack and the thawing out in the vault, you are free to move around. You are given tasks to do one by one by one. They're small tasks. They are not prompted by huge quest indicators. They're simply a course that you feel that you would naturally do. There's only one path to go. There might be a side path or two, small little things to look at, but nothing major that diverges from the primary path. The game makes you do basic things. Open a door, activate a switch, introduces you to loot. These are done invasively as a test. If the player can't understand these basic things, they cannot progress. This is the brick wall climb. The player is expected to slam into the brick wall until it occurs to them to climb over it. This is a way of gating content until the player is ready to experience it. It's the most overt form of guidance, and not really the best. Along the way, the player runs into corpses, various loot, there's potions on tables, cages to lockpick, and other challenges. Even introduces them to spell books and magic. Many players will never see the potions they can take in Helgen, but they're there regardless. The corpse in the cage will draw most players to look inside for the potential loot. More often than not, be driven to attempt to open it, and in doing so be subjected to the lockpicking minigame. These are contextual teaching tools. Unlike the brick wall the player slams into and then is expected to climb over, none of this is shoved down the player's throat. And do you see the problem with this method already? It can be skipped. Unless these steps are emphasized enough, unless the potion bottles are big enough, unless the cage sparkles or there's an indicator telling you to look inside it, a good chunk of players will skip them. And thus the teaching tools that were placed there, those options for learning in a controlled and, for the most part, combat-light environment, are lost. To those players, this sequence has failed to teach them anything. That's why the more overt methods, such as the brick wall climb, are far more effective teaching methods. Even then, the player could get frustrated at the brick wall, and instead of trying to overcome it properly, learning to climb it, learning to pull the lever, learning to open the door, learning to do these basic things that they would have to do, they tend to just quit. Now, as a developer of a full retail game, this wouldn't be too much of a problem because the financial investment is already there. The player has already paid into it. And that tends to keep people glued through the more basic elements of the game design. It's a sunk cost. And when there is a sunk cost, it tends to get people to put in that extra effort to learn the game and its systems. In free-to-play games, however, there tends to be far more hand-holding, or lack of any sort of barrier to subpar play until later on in the experience. Like the sunk cost, this is known as sunk time. You see, in a free-to-play game, at least at the very beginning, you can't use that sunk cost mentality to expect people to power through complicated learning. So in the beginning of a free-to-play game, typically the experience is very light, very accessible, until, again, much later on, until the player has sunk a significant amount of time. And where you can't get people to invest huge amounts of money, you might be able to get people to invest huge amounts of time. And once they've invested a certain amount of time, they feel committed to the product. Thus, you can have the more complicated teaching lessons later on in the experience. Now, when a game uses emotionally manipulative business tactics to earn more money from players via microtransactions, you can combine sunk cost and sunk time for even greater player perpetuation. This is especially valuable in the case of a multiplayer game where your player base is the essence of the game. Without the player base, you have no game. If a player is going to go, I can't stop now, I've already X. X being time, X being money, X being in-game accomplishments, or a combo of the three. Once the player does that, you've achieved your job as a games-as-a-service game developer. But going back to Skyrim for a moment, once you've climbed over those aforementioned brick walls, regardless of whether you took advantage of the contextual teaching tools about the potions to pick up, or the lockpick cage, or any of the other good things that are there, those solid teaching tools, as soon as you finish the brick wall and pass through the entire cave, you're released into the real game the moment you exit Helgen Keep. Now, the person you came with up till that point, they will run to Riverwood, and there are many other contextual learning tools along the way. This particular person you can escort to Riverwood will give you teachable moments such as what is Bleak Falls Barrow and what the Standing Stones are. But you can skip those and travel ahead to Riverwood if you want. In fact, he suggests you do so. Skyrim provided you with a linear path from beginning to end, and the open world nature of Skyrim didn't actually come into play until the moment you exit Helgen Keep. And even then, there is a tether attached to your character, a kind of passive quest that tells you to go to Riverwood, and then to warn the Jarl. That begins the main quest of the game. The main quest of the game, as I've mentioned before, is never the focus of an Elder Scrolls game. Only a small portion of players will ever just power through the main quest in under 9 hours and then say, this game was too short. It's possible to do. Absolutely possible to do. But hardly anyone ever does that. The same thing with Fallout 4. Fallout 4's game actually begins the moment you exit Vault via the elevator. And the game gives you one final chance to say whether all your character settings were correct before releasing you into the Commonwealth. And Fallout 4 isn't without its teachable moments either. It gives you the ability to access Red Menace. It shows you a cryolator case that you can come back and get later. And so many other aspects of the game are just put forth. Whether you completely avoid these teachable moments or not is entirely up to you. But let's take a moment and compare that experience to the introduction sequence of Oblivion. In the introduction sequence of Oblivion, you are in a jail cell, and then you are released into this underground passage.
You. I've seen you. Let me see your face. Gods.
Now, you are not going along the same path as the NPCs, but the sewers in Oblivion are filled with teachable moments as well. There are corpses that contain armor, that contain weapons. There is a prompt to shoot a bucket with an arrow. Most of these experiences can be skipped. and you can just power through the introduction sequence having learned very little. Or if you were inquisitive, if you looked at each piece of Oblivion, there was a lot to learn. But again, like Helgen Keep, it was a very linear experience leading up to the death of the Emperor. And at the very end, just as you're ready to exit the sewers and be released into the rest of Cyrodiil, you are given, again, the opportunity to change all your settings. Fallout 3 had Vault 101 and its linear introduction sequence that did all the same things. But then we get to Morrowind, and Morrowind has the shortest of those experiences. They have you type in your character's name. They have you look around. They have you follow the guard. They have you use the ship's hatch to go on deck. They have you get off the boat and talk with the guard to pick your race. Other than the simple use of objects, there really isn't any teaching tools involved. They do make you get Fargoth's ring from the barrel to make sure that you are able to understand looting as a concept. And they do make you go through a dialogue option in order to receive the package which unlocks the front door. The bare minimum of what's required to get you into the game. But still, those basic tools are still there. It's just the difference is, and I've mentioned this in other videos, cinematic storytelling. Because once you strip out all the cinematic storytelling and you were to just go based entirely on the mechanics, there isn't much difference between Morrowind, Oblivion, Fallout 3, Skyrim, and Fallout 4's introduction sequences. They're all based on a very small brick wall that you have to climb over in order to prove that you know the basic mechanics of the game. And then everything else along the way is a teachable moment. This works because the Elder Scrolls at their fundamentals are very, very simple games. The Fallout games at their fundamentals are very, very simple games. Go to enemy, hit them with weapon, enemy dies. Talk to person. Click on dialogue option. Make choice. The choices usually result in the same outcome, or very similar outcomes. But ultimately, as long as you teach the player the most basic things required to get them going, the introduction sequence is considered successful. Of course, someone here will want me to go back to Elder Scrolls 1 or 2, where they taught you absolutely nothing. Oh my, those tutorials are a mess. I'm not going to talk about those because that is an example of the wrong way to tutorialize your video game. As I said earlier, from a game design perspective, I learned early on that the best way to do a tutorial is to make the player perform those actions by thinking it was their idea to perform those actions all along. If they're going to form a mental bias, they should think that it was their own line of thinking that leads them to believe that. Instead of pointing the finger and saying, those guys are bad, these guys are good, instead, you should come to that conclusion all on your own. So, if all the games are pretty much the same in their introduction sequences, why do many fans celebrate Morrowind and say that Oblivion and Skyrim are significantly dumbing down or streamlining? And why do fans of the more modern games just not get why people would hate on the newer games? And that the older games don't have the same value as the newer games. A lot of it comes down to what you value in your video game. As I said in previous videos, Skyrim excels at one thing that no other game in the Elder Scrolls series really excelled at, and that was cinematic storytelling. Whilst Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard did tell you a story and was very good at doing it in cutscenes, those cutscenes weren't integrated into the actual game. You could not move your character while those cutscenes were going on. Your character was represented in those cutscenes completely free of your control. What Skyrim did is it actually took scenes, like when you walk into the Riverwood Trader, for example, and Lucan Valerius says, "I said no," No theatrics, no thief chasing. That is actually a form of cinematic storytelling, because if this were Morrowind, what would happen is the NPCs would be standing there. They wouldn't be talking to each other. You'd walk in, you'd hit the use key on Lucan, and Lucan would say, "Damn thieves," and you'd have to click on the dialogue topic for "damn thieves" to learn more about the damn thieves that stole his golden claw. You see how much more finesse Skyrim has in that sense? And that's why, if that's what you value, Skyrim's always going to come out ahead. You have the potential to present the story better, to tell it through a superior medium, because at the end of the day, again, I've worked on text-based games before. I can extol the virtues of a text-based interface for telling a story. I can tell you how awesome reading books are, but at the end of the day, if you are able to combine voice acting with 3D model animations, all of a sudden, you've got a story that is in living motion. That's where Skyrim excels. So why do people say that Morrowind is better despite that? That's because Morrowind is better. It's because Morrowind is a story about revenge, about redemption, about so many things other than dragons come kill dragons. It's very clear the people who worked with Morrowind's story knew what they were doing from a thematic standpoint, that they were writing a story. Whereas Skyrim's developers were developing a cool game. Recently, I was playing the Relic Hunter, my favorite way to play Skyrim. I'll do a video on that later on about why I think the Relic Hunter is the best way to play Skyrim. But first, back to the video topic, which is, despite the fact it's clear Skyrim has the superior tools to make the better story, they didn't bring the people to back that up. In fact, storytelling was never their priority with Skyrim. Story is in service to the gameplay. You can have the best story in a video game, but if the mechanics aren't interesting, then you've failed to make a video game. It takes some extreme balance to have an extremely good story and extremely good gameplay. Witcher 3. Witcher 3 managed to do this. Witcher 3 is not designed in a way that you could compare it one-to-one with Skyrim. It just isn't. The games are very different. However, The Witcher 3 managed to balance story and mechanics. And that's why The Witcher 3 will, in my opinion, always be the better game out of the two. So why does Skyrim get more gameplay out of me? Well, that's the mods mostly. The fact that it is so moddable that I can take my own character and through the use of mods have a completely different experience from another player. Would I consider playing Skyrim again without mods? Absolutely not. I spent about anywhere between 25 and 30 hours in Skyrim, and that's all I needed. My well over 2,000 hours of modded Skyrim, I'm ready to play more of that. But that's the community making interesting gameplay. I don't play Skyrim for the story. Other people say, well, if I'd want an interesting story, I'd read a book. I want a good game. And they aren't wrong to say that, really. It's to enjoy an open world sandbox. I think the same of Morrowind, really. Although Morrowind has a better story and better factions with better motivations, I still wouldn't play it mainly for the story. It is another open world sandbox to explore. So, getting back to the original theme of the video, the introduction areas in Morrowind gave us a world to explore, but they gave us investment in the character, so we're already invested that much. Character creation is a powerful thing, especially when it's not rammed down our throat with a pre-built character. Oblivion, we not only got to create our character, but then we were told to close shut the jaws of Oblivion, the Emperor died. In short, we're given a big reason to go forth and do that main quest. Oblivion had urgency attached to it. Now, Once we got out into that world and none of that urgency was present, it diffused the whole thing. Same thing with Fallout 4. We gotta find Sean! And then, of course, we build a settlement and things like that. Same thing with Skyrim. Other than the flying lizards going around attacking us every, 45 minutes, what was the point? All of these games, other than Morrowind, set stakes. Stakes that were very important, that we could completely ignore. And that's what made all of their stories fake. Even when you progressed in Morrowind significantly enough, it actually came to light that Dagoth didn't have the tools he needed to dominate the world yet. Turns out he needs Wraithguard, Sunder, and Keening before he can do anything. So it makes sense that he was simply consolidating power in Ghostgate and very slowly converting people into dreamers in Morrowind. It made sense that you could take 10 years to complete your quest in Morrowind. And it's okay because the villain is not on the verge of victory yet. He needs those divine tools and you bring them to him. In theory, you could sustain this for a decade or two. Kind of ridiculous, isn't it? But at the same time, yet another reason why the story of Morrowind makes sense, whereas the story of the other games doesn't in the context of a game. Makes me think back to Elder Scrolls 1, where it canonically, as far as the canon story goes, took you 10 years to go to all the provinces in Tamriel and finish the main quest. Kind of crazy the way Oblivion was supposed to have taken place in the closing days of the Third Era. Nah, none of that made sense. But I would have liked those games a lot worse had they actually forced me to go on some kind of timetable. No, I'm serious. I think that the fault lies with how the quest was written, not with how the game was designed. That is, the Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Skyrim main quests. I think they're all written with fake urgency. And I think the games shouldn't contain that urgency at all. Therefore, the stories shouldn't either. Either way, we finished the introduction sequences completely. Now we're out in the world. In Morrowind, there is a loose connection of quests in your journal that lead you from place to place to place, the Blades being your primary faction. But that's it. It was a very loose association. You were expected to wander the world and explore. Oblivion, how they got you from place to place in Morrowind was to, through your quest journal, explain to you where things were. For example, exit Balmora, turn right before the bridge, continue along the river until you reach the mine. Very simple directions. Now, some of the Imperial cult directions, it's clear they originally intended you to go to one place and then they accidentally didn't update it when they changed the quest location. As a result, a couple of the Imperial cult questline directions are wrong. And that is the virtue that Oblivion had when Oblivion introduced the quest indicator. Oblivion does the same thing. The quests will tell you where to go. They will tell you to go down the river a certain distance, then turn west, and things of that nature. Oblivion's quests were designed specifically to tell you where to go from point A to point B to point C. But the quest indicators, which you could turn on or off whenever you wanted, would give you that extra bit of, oh, I've got to go here, okay. For a lot of players, this encouraged them to turn off their brain and just follow the waypoint indicator. Whereas Morrowind fans, the ones who enjoyed exploring the world, they tended to turn off the quest indicator. Unfortunately, in the name of accessibility, Bethesda learned the lesson that the quest indicators were the primary method of getting players from point A to point B, not by telling them what to do. So, come Skyrim, they decided to design a brand new system where quests were automatically generated. Quests that are automatically generated have a little bit of a problem. And that is that the voice actor, the person who is playing the character, doesn't actually know where the quest is going to send you. As a result, they have no prepared dialogue for it. You will have an NPC that will tell you there's been some trouble nearby, and if you ask where that trouble is, they'll say, I'll mark it on your map. These Radiant quests, we're not talking about the main quest, we're talking about the Radiant ones. The Radiant quests will send you to a location marked on your map. The NPCs can't tell you where they're happening because the game doesn't know where they're happening. And you know, for supplementary quests, I don't mind that much. Especially if they're going hand in hand with some main quests that you can go to. Oh, and while I'm here, I'm going to do these two. I don't mind that. Where it really goes downhill with this whole system is, again, Bethesda learned the wrong lessons from this. And going from Oblivion, where they always told you where things were, to Skyrim, they told you less about where things were, because for the most part they didn't need to tell you where things were. They would just give you generic directions, because the voice actor didn't know where the NPC was positioned, therefore no real instructions could be given. So in Skyrim, because there isn't enough direction, while you can turn off the quest indicators, it would be stupid to do so, because the quests don't actually tell you where to go. They do not give you precise enough directions to find it on their own. You have to rely on that indicator, because psychically gifted knowledge is how you get from point A to point B in Skyrim, at least as far as the miscellaneous quests go. The main quest, obviously, they're a little more detailed in their instructions, but the problem is what Bethesda learned from this. The problem is Fallout 4. In Fallout 4, the entire game revolves around these Radiant quests. All the quests are Radiant, and even the ones that aren't Radiant, they do not give you specific instructions. Not ones that are good enough to find things. So even if you were to go into the INI file and turn off that waypoint indicator, you wouldn't know where things were because of that one line, I'll mark it on your map. I'll mark it on your map. I'll mark it on your map. And that's the problem. We bash the dialogue system a lot in Fallout 4 because it's not only bad as a gameplay standard, but it makes it nearly impossible to do good quest mods. Having NPCs go, I'll mark it on your map, is perhaps one of the laziest things I've ever seen. And yet, from the Radiant Quest designers' standpoint, they worked hard on that system. They worked really hard to make this system work for this game. Unfortunately, I don't respect it. So while I respect the amount of time and effort they put into developing that system, I feel that it is grossly misused. And when people say Bethesda is lazy, I can see why. I can seriously see why. When you go to the detail in Oblivion where they say, you know, cross the river, go across, and it's just to the west. Okay, I can respect that in terms of a world, having an NPC telling you those details. But then when it's, I'll mark it on your map. No, I don't respect that. And that's where we're at right now. But you can see how conveying a player from point A to point B, it was kind of an adventure in Morrowind, and you could get lost. And people would flip out, and they would have to, you know, go back to town. They'd have to look at their journal. They'd have to read what was written there. And through all of that, you got to experience more of the world as a result. You got to stumble upon things you would have never found before. In Oblivion, they added the waypoint indicator, but you could turn it off. And you could be confident with it turned off because the NPC still told you where you were going. Skyrim and Fallout 4 have dumbed it down. And yes, when we say that the Elder Scrolls are dumbing down, that's what I mean. I'm not saying that every bit of Skyrim is dumbing down. I'm not saying that every part of Fallout 4 is dumbing down. But I'm saying this specific aspect, The NPCs are too stupid to even know where they're sending you. I'll mark it on your map. So when I talk about the dumbing down, that's what I mean. Fallout 4 got the introduction sequence right. A very small level of brick walls, with just enough storytelling, with just enough skill tests and options for contextual learning. But then it learned all the wrong lessons. That's what I want you to take away from this story, is that teaching players from going to point A to point B to point C is an art. Some games do it incredibly well, some do it incredibly poorly. But at some point you have to trust the player. And if you don't trust the player, instead you count on waypoint indicators to handle everything, then quite frankly, you're not making the game that I want to play. At least not for the same reasons I'd want to play Morrowind or Oblivion. This is an appeal to Bethesda or anyone else who's a game developer who's watching. Please bring back the precise directions to where we don't need waypoint indicators. Put them as an option there. But I would very much like it if they respected the intelligence of the players and gave us the immersion of actually hearing the NPCs give us the directions, so that the directions themselves need be the only directions we get. Either way, thank you all for watching. Check the links on screen for more content. Expect some more videos pretty damn soon, and I will see y'all next time.
General Talia, sir. The headsman is waiting.
Good. Let's get this over with.
Sure. Mara, Debella, Kinnarev, Akatosh. Sure. Mara, Debella, Kinnarev, Akatosh.